Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today's on the over 55s living and just exploring your options around that. Today I'm joined by Kerry Darton. Kerry is a aged care specialist in the North Quay office of Morgans Financial. And so Kerry's going to be running through most of the major presentation today. And before that, you saw a quick disclaimer that it was just general advice only. There are contact details. So at the end of this presentation, or later when it becomes an issue for you, please feel to send out any information requests or queries you may have as a result of this or any of our other services. Okay, so today I think one of the key things is that aged care or over 55s living is very complex, very extensive. So today we're just going to be focused on two main areas, just because of the complexity of it, and that's residential care and retirement villages, so the over 55s living. What we're going to do is have some follow-up presentations, and we'll deal with some of the other ones around downsizing considerations, granny flat considerations, and so forth. So we'll deal with that in a later presentation. So right now, though, I'll hand it over to Kerry. There is a chat function that you should be able to see on your screen, and we'll have questions at the end. And if we don't deal with them there, you're welcome to, again, email us on those previous contact details. So, Kerry.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So, like Mark said, today we're going to concentrate mainly on residential aged care and on retirement villages for over 55 living. I'm not going to scare you with a whole lot of stats today. We all know we're in an aging population. We've got a complex user pay system, and the users have the ability to get government support. So we're going to jump straight into talking about the system and getting an understanding of where aged care fits. So as a person who needs to move into this space, there's a number of organisations and government agencies that people have to deal with. And this slide just demonstrates some of the complexities around that. So it's not a straight through process. You've got all of these different places such as Centrelink, Medicare, having an ACAT assessment, the actual aged care facility. All of them are interacting with each other at different times. And people are having to deal with multiple areas.
With that, Kerry, is it, it looks very complex with the different departments and institutions. Is there a streamlined process between the sharing of information at least?
Unfortunately, for people in this space, there isn't a streamlined, step 1, step 2, step 3. Sometimes they have to provide information to an organisation and then they have to go back and provide sometimes the same information to a different organisation, or a different organisation requires the information in a different format. So you have different contracts, you have different paperwork, you have time delays, and you have waiting lists, all of which you have to deal with when you're going through this, and which is often a stressful time when people are moving through a change or moving into care. So, Next slide. So just got the two options we're talking about today. I just thought it would be a good idea to give you a high level understanding of the different options. So the retirement villages and the residential aged care. Retirement villages the motivation is often a lifestyle motivation, and it's governed by state legislation. You have to purchase a tenure to occupy the retirement village. So that could be a lease, it could be a rental agreement, strata titles. There's lots of, depending on the actual individual village you're going into, can depend on the type of tenure or license to reside you have to purchase or sign. Retirement villages are personally funded, so there's no government support to buy into them. There's no government guarantee that you will receive back any of your money if something happens to that retirement village. And there's three main costs that you need to be aware of if you're looking at going into the retirement village, and that's the entry costs, your ongoing costs, and your exit costs, all of which should be outlined to you in your contract that you're signing, which is why we say you really need to get legal advice in this space if you're entering into a retirement village contract. Residential aged care, on the other hand, is federal legislation, and its access isn't based on you deciding that you want to go in there necessarily. It's usually based on a health reason. So you have to have an ACAT assessment, which is the aged care assessment team does an assessment of what your health is, what your health requirements are, and they decide whether you should gain access or not. So to move into an aged care facility, you need to have this ACAT assessment done. That's the same Australia-wide, except for Victoria, it's called an ACAS assessment, which is basically the same thing, but it's instead of an aged care assessment team, it's an aged care assessment service, but it's doing the same thing. It's assessing how you are from a health perspective on whether you can gain access to residential aged care that has government support.
Okay.
So as well as the government support, it has a user pay system, which is similar to your Centrelink means testing. They assess your assets and they're assessing your income, and they look at how much you can afford. Now, this has changed, and you'll hear a lot of war stories about 10 years ago when someone's parents went into an aged care facility, but there was legislative change back in July 2014, and since then it's very much a means tested based on asset and income. So there's actually 4 different fees when you're entering into residential care, whereas in the retirement village we had 3 fees. You have an accommodation cost. We'll talk a lot more about that later today. You've got a means tested fee, a daily fee, and an additional service fee. And I'm going to, we'll do a case study and we'll talk about those fees and how they interact and how we can assist people with those, managing those particular fees. So residential care is really when somebody gets to the stage where they need 24-hour nursing care, and it's often a crisis situation, whereas retirement village is often a lifestyle decision.
That crisis situation, if it's not planned, so therefore that becomes time critical and the stress levels go up because it's what advice do I get now because I need it urgently.
Having said that, that is very correct, and we find pre-planning is better than crisis planning because people don't have that. There's a lot of stress when it's a crisis, and there's so many other things that they've got to be worrying about. But one of the important things to remember is that if you are in that crisis situation and there's a whole lot of things that can be that need to be decided on, we can help you understand what steps you need to go through, and we have done that. But the other thing is that you've got 28 days from date of entry to make some of those decisions. So
those decisions are around residential accommodation deposits and those sort of things?
Yes. So it's about how much you're going to pay and how you're going to structure paying those going forward. Okay. So the next we'll talk about, I'm just going to go through some case studies. So I thought it might be easier if we could understand a family tree, and if we do future webinars, then we'll come back and revisit this particular family. So today we're going to talk about Mary and Peter, who are a married couple, and we're going to talk about Dawn, who is Mary's sister, and we're just going to look at different circumstances for those 3 people. So Mary and Peter are aged 71 and 72. They've been living in their family home, and they've been, they've retired. They've been doing a lot of travel. They've been enjoying their retirement, and they can still enjoy that. Don't look at me like that. But they're getting to the point where they don't really need the 4-bedroom family home anymore. They don't want to be the maintenance of that house, and they're looking for more of a community style
living. It's a lifestyle decision.
Yeah, lifestyle decision, and it's around they don't necessarily need assisted living, so they still can prepare their own meals and do all of their mundane things like laundry and things like that. So, but they're getting to the stage where they're thinking, we need to downsize, and where should we go to from here? So We discussed on the earlier slide the entry costs, the ongoing costs, and the exit costs. So they're the three costs that they've got to take into consideration when they're moving here. So if we, this is a very high level, simplistic view of going into a retirement village. There's a whole lot of other factors that potentially we need to take into account. But for Mary and Peter, they have a home that they own, which is about just over $750,000, and they're expecting that their net sale proceeds, if they were to sell their house, they're going to have about $750,000. They've got assets, liquid assets of about $325,000, which includes some shares, some cash, and that has a deemed income of just over $9,000. Their cost of entry to the retirement village, this is a lifestyle decision, so it's not crisis. So they've been looking at around at a couple of different places, and they've got two options that they're considering. Option one, there's a bed for about $650,000 that in this retirement village. And option two is that they're not sure if they want 3-bedroom, and they've been looking at another village that has 1 to 3 bedrooms, and those prices are ranging between $500,000 and $1.2 million. It's not like purchasing a house, so they're not going to pay stamp duty, they're not going to pay rates, but they are going to have to pay ongoing costs to maintain that village and that to gain access to those community services that are available in retirement villages. So the way the retirement village does that is that they'll have a weekly fee or a fortnightly fee that they charge as an ongoing basis, which covers maintenance of common areas and upkeep of the building. And then the third fee that we talked about is the exit cost. And in these two particular examples, one, the first option, they're going to be paying to go into the retirement village. When they leave, there's a 5% per year cost up to a maximum of 35%. Option two is structured slightly differently. Their exit costs are based around 30% over 3 years. So after 3 years, it's not going to increase any more than the 30%, but if they leave within that time, that's how much it's going to cost them.
So under those two different options, if the duration is going to be longer or shorter, is there a difference in the structure that you would take?
You really have to look at the individual village and what the contract that you're entering into. And this is, again, I think we mentioned earlier, you really need to get legal advice on your contract that you're going into a retirement village. And it's very much dependent on, a lot of them are privately owned, some are owned church run, but depending on what your entry costs are, it can affect what your exit costs are. Sometimes you can get a lower entry cost, but then that will mean they'll adjust your exit costs. So it's really on a case-by-case basis. You have to have an understanding of how that particular retirement village is going to structure their fees.
Is there anything around like a make good if you do things to the property that you need to leave it in a particular fashion, like the way that you entered that property?
That is all in your initial contract, and so there may be a refurbishment fee at the end that there needs to be new carpet or the kitchen needs to be renovated. Again, that's a village by village basis, and you just need to be asking those questions when you're entering in and being aware of what's going on. So in Mary and Peter's case, their decision is around what their personal preference is. And sometimes a retirement village, it may be that one of them is having health issues, and so they need more help. And quite often a retirement village will have an assisted living arrangement where you can buy in and you can pay additional fees to have food or meals supplied, and you can pay for cleaning to come in. But the thing about a retirement village as opposed to a residential aged care is that they are often an additional cost to you personally, and it's about your needs. some retirement villages are starting to have residential aged care facilities within them, or they have a preferred residential aged care. Just because you're in that retirement village, though, doesn't mean that you are going to necessarily get access to those facilities, because it'll come down to whether there's a bed available.
Yep.
And you've got to remember that retirement village is state and residential care is federal, so they're covered by you have different rights and obligations under the two different structures. So Dawn, Mary's sister Dawn, she's aged 73. She's a little bit older, and she doesn't have a partner who can help her, and her health is declining, and she needs to go into a residential aged care arrangement. So Dawn's had her ACAT assessment, which has said that she can access a residential aged care facility.
Yeah. And if you have an ACAT assessment, does it give you automatic access to a facility?
It gives you the right to access to a facility, but it doesn't give you automatic access to a particular facility. You still have to find a service that is appropriate. So if Dawn had dementia, then there's certain residential aged care facilities that she can go into, but others may not be able to cater for a dementia patient. So it's all, the ACAT assessment is about the government saying, yes, we're prepared to fund part of your care, and that you have a health need that means that you need to go into assisted living, 24-hour nursing care style living. So the 4 fees that Dawn has to deal with are the accommodation fee, the daily fee, the means tested fee, and the additional service fee. So the accommodation fee is a bit like the entry fee that we were talking about previously, but unlike retirement villages, the residential aged care, the accommodation fee is a published fee, and there's a maximum fee that a facility can charge without getting permission to charge over that, and that's $550,000. So the accommodation fee is made up of a refundable accommodation deposit. So, and then there's also a DAP, which is a daily accommodation payment if you aren't paying the full refundable accommodation deposit, which is often called a RAD. Yep. So we have a lot of acronyms around ACAT and RAD and DAP and things. So the daily fee is a set fee. It's based on 80% of the single person's pension. It doesn't matter whether you're receiving a pension or not receiving a pension. It comes down to, it's set at that, and so it's reviewed like the age pension in March and September each year and can increase. So at the moment that daily fee is based at $50.66 a day. Your means tested fee, which is the next fee listed there, is all around what income and assets you have, and this is where the user pay system comes in. So there's the Department of Human Services will do an assessment based on what your assets and income are, and they will establish a fee that you need to pay on a daily basis. Additional service fee is a fee that's charged by the facility, and it's usually about purchasing an additional standard of accommodation. So it can be tied to a particular room, or an individual can select particular additional services such as haircuts or a glass of wine.
And does that depend on the facility?
Yeah, it depends on the facility. So if we look at Dawn's situation a bit more closely, for the particular home so she's had her ACAT assessment, she's eligible to go into a retirement village, a residential aged care. These two different scenarios. In this case today, we're going to be talking about Dawn being a single person, but I just thought it might be interesting for people to understand as a couple what the slight difference is. So for Dawn, her accommodation cost for the particular facility we've chosen is $350,000, or a daily fee of $56.96. a day.
Just on that, I noticed that the RAD or residential accommodation deposit, you've used 350 on both of these scenarios here. Is that a reasonable assumption? Like particularly from a planning for a family perspective?
Yeah. So in Brisbane, we are finding that there are places for 350,000. Yep. The maximum that a facility can charge is 550 without getting permission to charge more than that. There are places that are charging up to $1 million. It depends on the standard, and where some people, because of location, like if it was northern beaches of Sydney, then it may be more expensive than somewhere in Brisbane. But we find that most people that we've been dealing with are about 350 to 450 at the moment, but it can be anywhere up to 550. But for today, we're using 350 just from an illustrative purpose.
Okay.
So the next fee, the daily fee, is the $50.66 a day, and the means tested fee for Dawn is $11.66. That's based, we've got some assumptions down here on what her fees are, what her assets are, and she's got a house worth $650,000, home and contents are at $5,000, cash she's got $75,000, and she's got shares of $250,000. So based on that scenario, her means tested fee has come out as $11.66. So Dawn gets a part pension based on that scenario, and she has deemed income of just under $10,000. So total income is about $28,000. The total fee, daily fee, so we've just assumed that she hasn't paid any of her RAD, and added the 56 and the 50 and the $11, and her total daily fee is about just under $120 a day. So per annum, that's $43,500.
So I suppose there's one aspect of the financial calculations of this. What about, can you talk about the difference if, I know you got a home value of 650 there and cash and shares there, difference in the funding options you take, does that create a different outcome, or is there particular time frames or options for you to deal with the family home? Because I imagine that's a very emotional decision for someone to sell that, because it probably creates that sense of permanency.
Yeah. So later in the webinar, I've actually got a couple of slides about things that people consider about whether to sell the home or not sell the home. It's a $1 million question of what's best for somebody, and depending on their circumstances, their emotional attachment to that property, and to estate planning reasons about whether they buy or sell, whether they sell or retain that house. The other thing is that there is concessional treatment of a home. So in Dawn's case, if she was in a partner relationship, then and her husband was staying in the house, and the $650,000 is not counted as an asset. It's considered that there's a protected person in the house, and it's not taken into consideration.
We'll come across that shortly.
We'll be covering off on that shortly. So in Dawn's case, she does have a shortfall, and it appears that can be quite daunting, but there are financing options that we can go through and gap this shortfall. If she was married, her agreed RAD stays the same. Her accommodation, so her daily accommodation fee is the same. Her daily fee is the same, and her means tested fees actually drop to zero because it's not taking into account the house in the couple scenario, and it's also allocating 50% of the assets to her. So it doesn't matter if they're jointly owned or owned by one person. From an aged care fee perspective, the assets of the couple are divided into 50%. So again, she's got a shortfall. If she was in a couple, she has a higher pension because there's pension for two people. Her deemed income is slightly lower than it would have been if she was in single, because of the deeming thresholds are higher for a couple. and she has a shortfall of nearly 11,000. So financing options that I'm considering today that could be considered for Dawn, and this is not an extensive list. There's lots of different options. So option 1 we're going to talk through is retaining her home, selling 50% of her shares to pay a partial RAD, and using the cash to pay her DAP, her daily payment. The option 2 will be to sell the home, pay the RAD, and put some funds into a term deposit. And option 3 is retaining the home, so the same as option 1, but instead of having to come up with the cash flow to pay that daily accommodation payment, we're going to deduct it from the initial lump sum that she's paid towards her refundable deposit, her RAD.
Okay.
So broadly speaking, the options to consider are liquidating assets and what assets we're going to liquidate. Are we going to pay will we fully pay the RAD? Should we partially pay the RAD, and should we deduct fees from the RAD? Just the 50% of shares that I've got there, we could have said 80% or 100% of selling shares, but often people have an emotional attachment to their share portfolio or particular assets, and so they may not want to use their cash that they have to pay for their RAD because they like to have a particular 30,000 cash reserve there, or they may want to have those particular shares. So it sort of comes down to discussing with the individual what they're comfortable with, and us then looking at options that can help you keep that level of comfort and security, but still have a better outcome from a financing perspective. So the cash flow, you're not coming up with a cash flow of deficit of 11,000 or 15,000.
And I guess it's just about them explaining and understand the opportunity cost of their decisions around those emotional attachments to particular assets.
Yeah. Okay, so this slide looks a little bit busy, and I'll try not to confuse people too much with this. But option 1, which we talked about, was retaining the home, sell 50% of the share portfolio, and pay a partial RAD. So that, if you remember back a couple of slides, we're saying the full RAD is 350,000. We're going to pay 175,000 of that, which then drops that that daily payment down to just over $28 a day. The daily fee still stays the same, and the means tested fee was at $11.66. The assumed income from the pension, so the assumed income is deemed income and pension income, so it's at just under 28,000. So the annual fees in scenario 1 results in 33,000. So the shortfall there is 5,200. So it's we've dramatically reduced that, but it's still not a great outcome because her inflows her outflows are exceeding her inflows. Option 2 is to sell the home and pay the full RAD and invest the balance of those assets into a term deposit, because the house has got a much higher value than what she needs to pay for her RAD. Again, your daily fee is the same. Your means tested fee has significantly increased here because your house before was an exempt asset. Now all of a sudden you've freed up all of that cash, and it's become a financial asset that's investable, and it's counted towards your means test for your means tested fee. So, and your assumed income, including pension, you've got assets there that are generating deemed income. So the overall income has gone up, but her pension income has significantly decreased. And her annual fees now are slightly higher at 33,620, and her shortfall is 2,173. Option 3 is where we go, okay, the shortfall is happening because of this daily fee, that the additional daily fee that has to be paid, which is just over $28. Option 3 is saying deduct that fee from the initial lump sum payment that was paid. So that initial $175,000 that you've paid. And then you're not having to come up with that cash flow. What it means that is once she exits the facility, that initial payment, the refundable accommodation deposit, is going to be lower because you're going to have had some fees deducted out of it. But it means that she's ended up, from her income that's coming in, from her pension, and we're using deemed income here, means that she's got a surplus of just over $5,000.
Okay. And with that if there are particular aspects around their assets from a timing perspective, they could actually pay a lower residential accommodation deposit or RAD.
Yeah.
And the fees would deduct that and diminish that. When it gets to nil,
yes,
they have the opportunity to top it up again.
Yeah. So they have with your RAD, you have the option to top it up at any future point. And some people enter into a facility and they want to pay the full RAD, but it means that they are diminishing their assets to below $49,000, which is the maximum that they're allowed. That they're not allowed. A facility is not allowed to charge you more than not allowed to leave you with less than $49,000 in assets when you go in for the first 28 days. After that 28 days, you can top up that RAD as much as you like. So you can pay the initial $175,000, and then once you've had some fees deducted, you can top that up. What you can't do is go, if I decide to go in and pay $250,000, and after 6 months we decide that we're going to sell the house and we need to use some money to get it so it's marketable, we can't go to the facility and say, I actually want $50,000 back of my RAD.
So there's a different terminology and a different level of care, or some level of care, but different facility or qualifying for residential aged care if you don't have financial assets.
Yeah. So that's when if you are classified as low means.
Yep.
And then we change the terminology from deposit to contribution. So you have a RAC and a DAC instead of a RAD and a DAB.
Yep.
But I think that there's a whole lot around low means and how to structure your finances around that. And it's very different if you're a couple or an individual. And we could probably spend half an hour talking about that.
Yeah, and I know that it is an extensive subject, so we'll probably cover that in another series, another webinar. But if there's anything in the meantime, they're welcome to send an email through to either of us or webinars@vincents.com.au.
Okay. So selling or retaining the home, we sort of slightly brushed on this earlier. You asked me about this, Mark. Yeah. And it really depends on the individual. There's no yes or no answer for this. The family home qualifies for exemptions under not only Centrelink if somebody's getting a pension, but also when the fees are being calculated. So retaining the home can actually assist in getting a higher age pension and a lower means tested fee, because the assets you have, the full value of the house could be exempt, or up to about $166,000 from a means tested fee perspective. So there's a whole lot of rules around that. That means that you can, selling the house may actually put you in a worse position than if you were retaining. So initially people think, oh, I can't afford the RAD. Well, we've shown you earlier that you can actually pay a partial RAD and then have some of the fees deducted, so that means that you're not having to come up with all of the cash flow to cover those fees. And you can, by maintaining the house, you're actually getting more age pension and you're paying lower fees.
This next one of your topic of estate planning, because of the work I do, I particularly find this probably, I would expect, one of the ones that gets overlooked.
Yeah.
The family home might be specifically bequeathed to someone, or they might have financial assets that they've specifically had a bequeath and request in their wills, and that the RAD actually gets repaid to the estate but can actually diminish in value, or they're using the house. So is it something that you come across a fair bit in your work, that they need to address their estate?
It's something that we talk to people about all the time, because from an estate planning perspective, it doesn't matter who pays the RAD. So it gets paid back to the state and distributed as per the estate. So if you have the example that you just used, if somebody is supposed to be getting the family home is sold to pay the RAD, and the fees are being deducted from it, not only is that value diminishing, but when it gets paid, it may be that the will says that the assets are to be distributed, the cash is to be distributed equally amongst certain children.
That can be a complicated area, particularly if the RAD, you mentioned that anyone can pay that RAD.
Yeah.
So if the RAD is paid by perhaps one of those children as beneficiaries, because they have the means to do so, the fact that the RAD needs to be repaid to the estate could cause a complication, because it was actually the one of the childs that paid for the RAD to start with.
And there's a couple of complications that come out of that, because the RAD actually will increase the assets that are being assessed from a fee perspective.
Yep.
And it'll also mean that that isn't paid back to the person
who actually
paid it. And sometimes siblings is okay, but if you decided to pay for your brother and then his children went, oh no, but you gifted that to my dad, that's actually our money and part of his estate now, that estate will distribute, not pay back to you.
So perhaps seeking of some legal advice around loan agreements, for the RAD.
Yeah, very much so. And one of the issues that can come up from an estate planning perspective is that if they've entered residential care, they may not have the mental capacity to act on them for themselves, and so therefore they can't modify the will. So this is all around that pre-planning rather than crisis planning as well. Means that we need to, as you're aging, you really need to start to think about what your estate intentions are, and how you want that to fall out. And
particularly because of that, having enduring powers of attorney is particularly important.
Yeah.
And they may be able to deal with at least the financial aspects of that, of a loan and the RAD, which could, if because the estate can't be reflected, they might be able to deal with that. So seeking advice in that area is particularly important.
Yeah. We're sort of going over time a bit here, so do we want to quickly go through the last few?
Yep.
So other issues around selling or retaining the house is sometimes it's not practically, the practicality of actually selling it and getting it ready can be difficult. Who's actually going to do the work? Who's going to pay for any work that needs to be done? And then you've also got, if you decide to keep the house and rent it out, then if the person who has dementia moves into a facility, they may then have a longevity that happens because they're being better cared for. So they could actually survive more than 10 years in the home. And after 6 years, there's going to be capital gains tax implications on selling the house. Does somebody need to remain living in the house? So we talked briefly about protected people, but the other situation you may have is that parents may live in New South Wales. They've moved into a home. Mum moved in first. Dad stayed in the house. Now dad needs to move into the home. Their daughter or son lives in Brisbane, and they're going down every 3 months or so to visit mum and dad, who are now both in the home, and they're staying in the family home for short periods of time. So there's a whole lot of issues around whether it's appropriate to sell or not sell, and family dynamics, wills, various things. So that's the protected person, and sometimes it's not a protected person, but it's still appropriate to have it. Persons entering into an aged care facility, they often don't believe that they're not coming home. So you often can't sell it because dad thinks that he's just in there until he gets better. And so you may have that the decision to sell may have to be deferred for 6 months or 12 months. Is the home located in an area that has current unfavourable market? It may just be that there is renovations going on next door, or there's something happening that means that if you put it on the market now, it's not going to sell, and you know that in 6 months' time it'll be better off.
Yep.
And then importantly, around selling and retaining the home, we've been saying that sometimes it affects age pension and things. war widow pensions and disability pensions have different means testing rules, and so the benefit of selling may not be as significant for those people. So just because somebody's on a pension doesn't necessarily mean that the decision of selling, not all the rules are the same. So if you've got a war widow's pension or a disability support pension, you really need to have a look at the impacts of that.
Yeah. Okay.
So I've probably talked for way too long. So over to you.
Yeah, look, I mean, thank you. Firstly, thank you. It's clearly, I mean, that's a very high level, and I know that it's been pushed through quickly just for the purpose of today's webinar. But clearly a complex area, and I suppose the part there that's highlighted is very much personalised.
Yes.
So it depends on the individuals, the family's needs, the individual's needs. All their financial structure might be different, which is what's going to drive the outcomes on that.
Yeah.
So we can probably click on the chat room, but we mightn't have time for this. But I suppose from my perspective, look, if there's anything else that you require information on aged care, feel free to email webinars@vincents.com.au or myself or Kerry, which the contact details are there, or any other aspects of our services in financial advisory in our investment superannuation, asset protection, structuring, or strategic advice. We're happy to assist, and we're happy to dovetail that in with the aged care requirements as well. Or any other aspects in the business advisory and so forth. So I suppose one of the things that I just want to finish off on is really around the part that because it's financial and it's complex, a lot of people can do the financial aspects of it. But one of the things I've experienced by working with you and referring to you in that is that the part that can be underestimated and should not be underestimated, and what I've seen is just because of your level of emotional intelligence and empathy, the difference that makes with a family in the way that it's been dealt with. So congratulations on your service delivery on that. It's excellent, but it's very, very important aspect to get the financial aspects through and to make sure the process is seamless. So thanks for that. So what we look forward to, if there's any further questions come through, please email them through. And we look forward to inviting you to our next series coming up on the rest of it, which is still quite comprehensive. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.